Good afternoon, everyone in the room and online. I'm Michael Talbot. I'm a new member of the Society. I'm a Ottoman historian, usually a document historian. So although I'm interested very much in coins, I use them in my teaching. I've only started really to use them in my research. So this is one of my first numismatic presentations. So please be kind, but also be critical. And I'm really looking for advice on how to make this better and for any additional sources or comparators you might have. So I'm going to be talking about a coinage that I think I'm quite confident saying I've identified, which belongs to the Bani Khalid Emirate, which is on the Arabian side of the Persian Gulf, that exists as an independent state, really, in the last part of the 17th and for most of the 18th century. So I'm going to briefly say where and what they are before talking a bit about their coinage, starting with the thing that got me into this, which is a version of the larin called the Tawilat al-Hasa, which is produced in that part of Arabia. And then looking at these group of fulus, so small, very small copper coins that seem to be minted by the amirs in al-Hasa, which is the center of the emirate. And I have some questions really for the audience for some help, just to see if you can help me to find other examples, but also to see if there's any similar types of coinage in the wider region, because I think there are some potential, particularly looking at Iran and India, for there to be some numismatic influence coming in here. So very briefly, the Bani, and I've done the maps in slightly weird ways. So like north is on the left-hand side, just because this is a centering, if you like, of this uncentered area. So the Bani Khalid or the Banu Khalid are a Bedouin tribe from Najd, center of Arabia, who migrate for various reasons towards the coast in the middle of the 17th century, where they encounter weak Ottoman rule and essentially overthrow the Ottoman garrisons by 1669, 1670, and set up their own state around the oasis in Hofuf, but also from then control two of the most important ports on that side of the Gulf, Al-Uqair, which they developed quite a lot, but also El-Qatif, which is one of the most important stopping points for European and Asian merchants coming up to Basra to get access to the inland routes from there. So their area of control is largely sort of situated in that central part of the map. At various points, they are able to extend their control all the way up to Abu Dhabi and all the way up to Basra. So they have a lot of power, particularly in the first decades of the 18th century. They are very poorly understood and studied, partly because of a question of sources. Almost no Europeans go there in this period. We have one, maybe two accounts, at least one of whom didn't actually go there. So because of that lack of European sources, European scholars have not been interested in this region. We also have a paucity of Arabic language material. We have, and I'll show an example in a bit, some Islamic court records that have some interesting information on trade and commerce, but these are very difficult to access, and we largely have to rely on local historians who have published sources. We also have the question of what happens to the Bani Khalid Emirate, which is by the 1780s and the early 1790s, they are overpowered by the first Saudi state and the Wahhabis, who essentially destroy, as they do, everything, including most likely many of the records that would have been in El Qatif and Hofuf. So we don't really have that much documentary evidence that we know of. There might be some stuff in Saudi and in Kuwait waiting to be found. But anyway, so what I'm trying to do is to understand this polity using the very small amounts of coinage that we can kind of identify as coming from this region. And that's where I begin with this later version of the larin, the Tawilat al-Hasa. I'm a bit obsessed with larins. I think they're beautiful things, partly also because they allow us to tell a story of intra-Asian trade without having to go to the Europeans or the European sources. So what I'm showing here is a set of separate studies, really. I'm doing something on Ottoman larins. I'm doing something on the larin as an economic culture. And from that, I've then found myself in Eastern Arabia looking at the Bani Khalid. So this is the Tawilat al-Hasa. It is small, copper or billion. It's hard to tell sometimes. If it is billion, it's very, very poor billion and mostly copper. almost all of the examples that we have, apart from one in the museum in Qatar, are like this, incredibly worn. And this is because they were in circulation for a very long time, at least a century, probably for a lot longer. We have records of them being used all the way up into the 1870s. So in some cases, a century and a half of circulation. They seem to have been produced at a discrete point in time. The examples that we have are almost all of the same design, and perhaps from similar. The dye study would be helpful, but we haven't got that many examples, and they're so worn it's hard to do. But why they're interesting is what we can read on them appears to be Ottoman inscriptions. So this side, which is usually the most legible, has here the Kaf and Aleph from Hakan al-Bahrain, which is one of the Ottoman Sultan's titles, Sultan al-Bahrain wa Hakan al-Bahrain. And that appears on the big Ottoman Kurush in the late 17th century and the 18th century. The other side, which is almost always illegible, seems to have occasionally words that look like Sultan and a word that might be Ahmad. So it's probably going to be early 18th century Ahmad III in the Ottoman Empire. And there's been a lot of discussion of this in the numismatic literature. John Walker said, yeah, these are definitely minted in the name of the Ottoman Sultan. John Pott said, no, they're definitely minted in the name of whoever was ruling there. I think, and I'll show that both of these things are true, that they are minted in the name of the Ottoman Sultan by the local amirs. But what's also interesting for me in looking at the Tawilat al-Hasa in a broader context is that external influences that are not Ottoman. So the famous larins, which are these quite long, sort of, 4 or 5 centimeter beautiful pieces of silver, which of course originate in Iran. The most common examples, the most famous examples, are from the late 16th century, really kind of the 1540s, with a peak in the 1570s, 1580s, when they're being used throughout the Arabian Sea in international trade. So this is a typical example of a sort of 1580s Safavid larin. There are also Ottoman larins being produced in the same period in Basra, also in Baghdad, that are circulating in both the inland and the overseas trade. I've been working on categorizing this, and I'm hoping to publish on that relatively soon. But the form of the larin changes in the 17th century. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, of course, the very famous examples of these are from Sri Lanka, where they are turned into what becomes known as fishhook larins. They're bent over again for various reasons. Anyway, things change in the 17th century, and Safavid larins start to become shorter. The same weight, about 4.8 grams of very high purity silver, but aesthetically they start to become shorter, and we start to see a larger number of aesthetically similar larins being produced on the west coast of India, particularly from the Deccan Sultanates. So Bijapur is a major center. Dabul is the primary, as far as we can see, mint for the Bijapuri Adil Shahi larins. And this is where the influence on the Bani Khalid Tawila comes from. It's not from these older forms of long larins from Iran or from the Ottoman Empire. It's these mid to late 17th century forms. So there's clearly is a numismatic conversation going on between whoever's minting coinage in Al-Hassa and South Asia and Iran, which is something I want to explore. So on to what I'm really here to talk about, which are these fulus, these small copper coins from the Bani Khalid Emirate that I'm very interested in because they give us a political insight, I think, that other sources don't, in the fact that they are produced by the Bani Khalid themselves. The only chronicles really that we have surviving from this period are written later by the Wahhabis, who obviously have a particular bias within their sources. So these may be some of the few, apart from court records, examples of Bani Khalid sources. Now, this set of coins is not unknown. They are very well documented in catalogues, especially in Steve Album's checklist, where they are called Ottoman brackets Arabian mints, and they're organized by Ottoman Sultan based on the dates that are kind of visible on some of these coinage. I have no major disagreement with the way that these things have been organized. I think the dates are the dates. They map up with the right Ottoman sultans, but there's a more complicated picture to be told here when we actually look at these things. Now, the first thing that I got a bit confused with was the statement in the checklist that these coins were minted in a place called Ar. Now, Ar is on the border basically between Saudi and Iraq. It's an oil center, as many places in Saudi, that part of Saudi are. I've never been able to find a historical reference to anything of a settlement there. The Wadi Ar is a famous poetic valley of the junipers, but as a city, it didn't exist. And that's because it's in the middle of nowhere, right? So it's in the middle of the desert. There isn't actually an oasis really anywhere near it. So pre-modern settlement there would have been very difficult. And it didn't happen because as you start to look into the history of this place, it was established in the 1950s as an oil station, and it was a workers' camp for the oil workers. So these coins cannot be minted in a place called RR because it just doesn't exist before the middle of the 20th century. So what or where or who is RR? And this is an example of one of these coins that has been identified as being from RR. We can see it quite clearly there, an ayin and a ra, right? So it's RR. There's no doubt about that. But I contend that this is not a place, but a person. And it's one of the amirs of the Bani Khalid Emirate. Now, I've been able to use some of these published collections of Sharia court records to try and understand what the economic situation is like in East Arabia in this period. And thankfully, one of those that was published was a grant by one of the amirs donating some food to feed the poor at Ramadan. And here we can see the name, and I'll make it a bit bigger, of the amir, Ar, right? The trouble is his name in modern Arabic is written as Ura'ir. So it's a diminutive form. And he's almost never referred to in modern sources as Ar, it's Ura'ir. So the contemporary sources show us clearly that there is a ruler who uses this spelling Ar in the middle of the 18th century. And what's more, his seal that just happens to be on this is the only document that has this thing on by pure chance that's been published, has his seal there that has a very similar aesthetic form to what appears on the coin. So I am pretty confident that this is the guy who is making these coins. And I'm very happy to be corrected, but I wouldn't be speaking to you if I wasn't a little bit confident with myself. So what about this set of coins, this wider set of coins that might tell us something about the history of this emirate that's left very few sources and that's been neglected? Well, using the different types, and I've been very lucky through my teaching collection at my university to acquire some quite recently, I've been able to have a good look at them. So I've kind of organized them along the lines that Steve Album has, because I think his chronology is correct. But what we need to look is to decenter them from the Ottoman side and think about them from the perspective of who's in charge of Al-Hassa in this period. So the earliest type is this anonymous type of faz that only includes a religious declaration of one kind or another, either glory to God or victory to God. It's one of the two. And on the other side, it has a lion. That is definitely a lion. Steve Album in his catalogue says he first thought it was a crocodile when he saw it. I can see that, but it's a lion. Remember that lion because we're going to come back to it. But it's anonymous. So only in a couple of these examples, and I've put the number of examples that I've been able to identify from my initial research. We have very few of these, partly because it's hard to find them because no one knows how to catalog them, but also because they're really, really tiny and they're copper and no one cares about them. So we only have a few examples, and only a few of those examples have visible dates. The one date that's visible on these ones is either the Hijri year 1121 or 31. It's impossible really to tell the difference, but that allows us to place it in regnal terms, definitely within the reign of Ahmed III, who's probably being acknowledged somehow still as the Sultan through the Tawila. But more importantly, it's during the reign of Sa'adun, who is the most powerful ruler of the Bani Khalid, who expands the borders of his realm and is clearly minting some coins as a sign of this new power and prestige. So that's the first type. The second, and there's two variants of these. Again, these are quite small, it's about 14 millimeters. They're usually in non-round shapes, so sort of long like this, oblong squares. They're very light, they're very small. But this one is particularly interesting because we have quite a few more examples of these. And they have a very interesting inscription. On one side, it doesn't say victory to God, it says victory to Mahmud. And this can only be, given the dates, the Ottoman Sultan Mahmud I. So this is complicating the picture somewhat. And this period aligns with a slight decrease in power of the Bani Khalid amirs. There's been a civil war amongst cousins and sons. There's a bit of a legitimacy crisis. So clearly one of the rulers is invoking the name of the former ruler of the area as caliph, probably, to give himself a bit of legitimacy. There is also a lion on these coins. Never forget the lion. You can't see a very good on my example, but you can just see the bottom. You can see his tail and his spindly legs and his weedy body here. I haven't figured out what the symbolism of the lion is. I mean, the Arabian lion, of course, wanders around that area, but it's something they seem to favor on their coins. So we've seen a transition from an anonymous coin that's being minted in a powerful period of the emirate to a bit of a transition where there's been dynastic issues where they're starting to invoke the Ottoman Sultan. And the clearest example of this is the third kind, of which we have, again, a few examples, but some very nice examples that often show us the full impression of the coin. This is minted during the very short reign of Sultan Osman III and at the accession of Ar, the guy who we met a bit earlier. And we know that it's Ar because he puts his name on his coins. So on the what I'm classing, and we had a discussion already about what obverse and reverse is in this context. What I'm classing as the obverse is the name of the Ottoman Sultan, and it's written from bottom up, right? So As-Sultan Uthman. On my example, you can't see the Uthman, but on this example, you can see it quite clearly. So we know it's definitely that name. On the other side, it has Ar Abduhu, right? So his servant, his slave, his liege, subject. So this is a very powerful statement that Ar is saying that Sultan Osman is my lord, I'm his servant. And he's done this at the very start of his reign when he's just taken power. Again, he's got some quite tenuous claims to the emirate, so he's invoking the name of the Ottoman Sultan. This then changes once again, and there's a very good reason for this. The Ottoman Sultan disappears after just a few years from this coinage completely, and we have a series of coins minted exclusively in the name of Ar, with the Ottoman, sorry, I've misspelled Nasrahu there, with the Ottoman invocation for victory, may his victory be glorious, on the other side. This is the time when the Wahhabis are really gaining power in central Najd, and the emirate are finding themselves in almost constant warfare against the Saudis and the Wahhabis. So this is clearly a statement of Ar as a warrior king who's engaged in this pretty existential battle that the emirate will eventually lose, although in his period they raid and attack the Wahhabis right in the middle of Arabia in Daraa. So that's the examples I have in my collection. There's a further final one from a later Amir, Sa'dun, who incorporates a bit of all the elements. He's got his name on it, he's got as a Nasrahu, and he's got the lion. That's another lion. I know it looks even less like a lion than the other ones on this other side. It looks a bit like a fish. It does, but it's got legs and, I don't know. Anyway, we won't critique long dead coin makers. So that's what I think is the coinage of the Bani Khalid Emirs. What I'm trying to do is to understand this in a context, right? Because they are clearly not existing in a vacuum. They're engaged in peaceful diplomacy, commercial trade, and warfare with everyone around them. And that almost always has some impact on aesthetics and coinage. So I've been trying to find who they are trading with and whether there's any similarities, particularly in the copper coinage of the region. So I started with Yemen because they are independent from the Ottomans too by this period. They never invoke the Ottoman Sultan, but they produce large amounts of copper fulus. But I've yet to see any aesthetic or a similarity in terms of the weight or anything like that between what's going on in Yemen, who are trading via Muscat, and what's going on with the Bani Khalid. So then I was thinking, what about the Ottoman world? Because they're clearly invoking the name of the Sultan. There's river trade going on between the Ottoman world and Basra, and then on to El Qatif and Hofuf. We have the overland routes going via Baghdad, going to Aleppo, going to Damascus. The camel routes are very popular in the middle of the 18th century. Thousands of camel being sent from the Bani Khalid Emirate to the Ottoman Empire. But again, there's nothing similar in aesthetics or weight or anything else. The one exception might be Basra, but we know very little. We have almost no examples of copper coinage from Basra in this period. The one example I think I've identified is a very tentative identification, but there might be something there. The other area that I don't know anything about really, and that I'm hoping for advice from experts who do, is what is going on in Iran and what is going on in the various Indian states, not just in the Mughal Empire, but particularly in the states in the south, where we know that there are commercial links, and what's going on with the coinage in the Bani Khalid Emirate. So I've been doing a little hunting, and the closest thing that I found are these half kasu from Mysore that seem to be minted, as far as I can tell from the literature, from the final decades of the 17th century until Hyder Ali takes over, basically. You remember my lion that looks a bit weird? there are some ways when you could look at this elephant at the bottom. The trunk is done a little bit separately, and it looks like it's open jaws. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but there is more of an aesthetic similarity between these half kasu from Mysore and what's going on with the Bani Khalid. It might just be a coincidence. I don't know, but there seems to be a lot of stuff going on there, right? And the lion, the beading around the sides. So if there are other examples that anyone who works on particularly Southern and Western Indian coinage can find, I would be very grateful for it. And that's really how I'm going to end. These are my questions that I'm still trying to find out. First of all, have you seen any other coins like the ones I've showed you in any other collections? Because catalogs are impossible to find because no one knows how to catalog them apart, so I've only been able to find examples from auctions, from Zeno, from places like that. So if you ever spot tiny little fullus with weird looking lions on them, please email me. And I would very much like to hear if there are similar cases of small fullus with these sorts of designs from Iran or India. Thank you for your patience, and thank you in advance for any critiques or help you might be able to give me. Thank you.